fellows and affiliates. These are the minutes of the ordinary meeting, Thursday, the 14th of December, 2023, Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President, in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, the 7th of December, 2023, were read and signed. The following communication was then laid before the Society: The History of Christmas by Professor Ronald Hutton, FSA. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, the 1st of February, 2024. Then adjourn the meeting. Christmas reception.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. Ballots.
Thank you. Fellows, we just thought it was worth reminding you now that we've gone online to remember to vote. So I'm just going to read out the current names for February, and I think you've probably just had an email about March, but don't forget to go online and vote, please. So the list for February: Martin Allfrey, BA, MA, Senior Collections Curator, West at English Heritage. Elizabeth Clark Ashby, BA, MA, Curator of Books and Manuscripts at the Royal Collection Trust. Andrew Baines, BSc, MSc, Deputy Director of Museum Operations at the National Museum of the Royal Navy. James Canton, BA, MA, PhD, Lecturer in Literature at the University of Essex, specializing in landscape and the relationship between humanity and nature. Brett Greatley Hirsch, BA, MA, PhD, Associate Professor at the University of Leeds, specializing in early modern drama and digital humanities. Tamsin Lewis, BA, a musician and Associate Lecturer on Renaissance Art and Music at the Courtauld Institute. Lucy Morton, BA, at Exeter University, a historian at Exeter University. Leonard Nydorf, BA, PhD, a philologist and Anglo-Saxonist at Nandsberg University, specializing in Beowulf. Terence Newman, BA, MA, a maritime archaeologist and works at the National Listing and Marine Team with Historic England. Nicola Pickering, MA, MPhil, PhD, an architectural historian with the Tynescape Consultancy and an extensive publication record. Richard Taylor, BA, MA, an archaeologist, author, and TV presenter, and Deputy General Manager of the Kent Archaeological Society. Stephen Wass, B.Ed, M.A. DPhil, a freelance archaeologist working in historic gardens and landscape archaeology. Stephen White, B.A., M.A., M.A., senior archaeologist with Archaeology Southeast at UCL Institute of Archaeology. Hugh Williams, M.A., M.Sc., MPhil, an independent researcher focusing on Roman archaeology and numismatics, and who served on the Royal Numismatic Society Council. Magnus Williamson, B.A., DPhil, Professor of Early Music at Newcastle University, and Helen Wilde, B.A., M.A., Senior Curator of Historic Textiles at the National Museum of Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The blue papers for those are available on the website. As the Honorary Secretary says, please do cast your ballot.
Thank you.
Admissions.
The following being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statute, desires to be admitted a fellow. Angus Vine.
Angus, by the authority and in the name of the Society of Antiquaries of London, I admit you a fellow thereof. Congratulations and welcome. We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear a lecture on analysing myth and material, Charles I's knitted waistcoat. Our speakers, Dr. Jane Malcolm Davis, Associate Professor of Textile Analysis at the University of Copenhagen, works on biocode ecology project. She also leads the Knitting in Early Modern Europe, an initiative begun in her Marie Curie Fellowship. Jane is co-director of the Tudor Taylor team of researchers who publish resources to promote the accurate reconstruction of historical dress. She's run innovative projects in cultural heritage for historic royal palaces, Buckingham Palace, including costumed interpretation at Hampton Palace for 12 years. Beatrice Behane studied fashion design in Germany and the history of dress in London before becoming a curatorial assistant at Kensington Palace. She's taught at art colleges and worked in contemporary art galleries. In 2003, she returned to historic royal palaces, curating exhibitions on royal clothes. And since 2007, she's been senior curator of fashion and decorative arts, Museum of London, and since 2005, associate lecturer at Central St. Martin's. She's lead curator, Our Time, ground floor of the new Museum of London, which we much look forward to seeing. So we welcome our two lecturers this evening to hear the paper on analysing myth material. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for this lovely introduction. I'm Beatrice. This is Jane.
I just wanted to say that we hadn't expected to be in such august company. It's a pleasure to be here. I include in that august company the surprise of Queen Mary. I had no idea that she lived here, and it's a pleasure to see her. I hope she's going to approve of everything we say.
So the object we're going to talk about, you can see on the screen at the moment. But I'd like to start with giving thanks to the organizations who so generally gave funds to this project and made it possible. And this includes the Society of Antiquaries. We also received grants from the Worshipful Company of Dyers and the Worshipful Company of Weavers. And our thanks also go to the Macauer family. I know some of the families here today, descendants of the original donors of the garment to the museum, and they have championed this project throughout. Before, and please hold up your hand if I start talking not loud enough. Before I start, I want to say a few words about terminology. Waistcoat was the contemporary term for a type of knitted undergarment which was worn for warmth. Waistcoats appear in the wardrobe accounts for Charles I and other people of means, and you see a little bit from Charles I's wardrobe account here. We know the ones that are listed here were knitted because they appear with hose, and as you can see, even with tennis socks. Waistcoat was also used for garments made out of fabric, and we'll come to that later. But this is why what I'm going to talk about, we call it a waistcoat. At some point in the past, it was called a vest, but waistcoat is really the contemporary term. The waistcoat was given to us in 1924 and is recorded in our register as a gift from Mr. and Mrs. Ernest Macauer. And note the letters after his name, FSA. He was also a fellow of the society. This referred to Ernest Samuel Macauer and his wife Rachel, née Caro. He was the youngest son and one of 5 children of Moritz or Maurice Macauer and Jessie Isaacs. Moritz had come to London from Prussia in the mid-19th century and became a successful silk warehouseman or wholesaler. And he was based at number 40 Old Change, which is the street you see here. It's a now destroyed street, which runs south from Cheapside, very near St. Paul's. So St. Paul's would just be to the right of you. And I'll just show you, oh, it's not stuck, one moment. Yeah. You can see here, it's a sort of close-up, you can see at this point. The company went through a few changes with various partners. So at this point, they were partnered with Sydney. Both Ernest and I believe originally his older brother Clifford Jack worked in the family company. Moritz retired in 1917 and then Ernest continued. Ernest and Rachel married in 1901 and they became generous benefactors of the then London Museum. This had opened at Kensington Palace in 1912 and after short closure had reopened in 1914 at Lancaster House. Between 1924 and 1934, the couple made 17 donations to the London Museum, individual objects or groups of objects, which mostly related to prominent Londoners. I should say that Ernest Macquart also was a trustee of the museum for a while. And I'll just show you some of the objects that were donated. There were further relics, as they would have been known at that point, of Charles I, so objects related to Charles I, not the stomacher, obviously, on the left, but these things came together. There were objects, there's a suit that was supposedly worn by the actor David Garrick, which will, I believe, go on display in the new museum. And then one of my all-time favorite objects in the museum, it's a lay figure used by the sculptor François Roubillac. And let me just see whether that worked. Yes, we scanned it a while ago just to see what it is made up inside. And it can be dressed up as a male or a female figure. So the waistcoat, when we acquired it, or when rather the Ernest Macquart and his wife acquired it for the museum in 1924, came with a letter of authentication. And according to that, the waistcoat was worn by King Charles I, on the day he was beheaded. It then came to a Dr. Hobbs, his physician, who attended him on the occasion. So this is what it says. I'm not saying this is true. I'm saying this is what it says on the letter of authentication. The doctor kept it, and then it went to his daughter, Susanna Hobbs. From there, it went to her husband, Temple Stanion. And then it went to, she died quite early, and then it went to Grace Stanion. Here it says it was, she was Stanion's second wife. I believe she was his third wife. We will come back to this later. I'll go through it again, and then there will be a little test for you. So we know that, or at least it has been said, that Charles definitely asked for an extra shirt because the beheading it happened in January, so it would have been cold, and he didn't want to tremble so that people did not think he was fearing what was about to happen. So apparently he said, let me have a shirt on more than ordinary. He did not say, let me have a knitted waistcoat on more than ordinary, but you know. So one of the things we have done as part of this project is people have done this before, started to do this kind of work before, but of course this kind of work is much easier now that we have things with Ancestry. Now we have Ancestry. So we now have this massive tree on Ancestry where we can follow through the provenance of the waistcoat. And quite a lot of it works out in line with the note of authentication. So before the Macquarts, it belonged to Philip Burney Ficklin, who had a number of other Charles I relics, and he had bought it at auction. I didn't say that Ernest and his wife bought it at Christie's in November 1924. Before that, it had been in the auction house of J.C. Stevens. So this is where Philip Burney Ficklin bought it in 1902. And the previous owner was Ernest Arthur Brocklehurst, who owned it only for a year. He died very young at the age of 38, although I'm still not 100% sure I've actually got the right person there. I can't find out that much about him at this point. Before that, it was in the same family. So the last person who had it in the same family was Captain Daith. He had it from 86 to 98 when it was sold on. And it had come through the Daith family through several generations. And the first person his name was originally William Youth, but he took on the Daith patronym when he was bequeathed a house by his uncle, by one of his relatives, I think his uncle. And then it gets a bit complicated. Then it moves across to another part of the family. It moves to Elizabeth Lucy Hardy, née Ware, and she was, and I have to read this out, so Admiral Daith was the son-in-law of the brother of her father-in-law. So quite a distant relative, but a relative nevertheless. And that had always puzzled me before, why, how it had come from her to this other side of the family. Then she had married Charles Temple Hardy in 1800, and she inherited presumably the garment when he died. And we have the wills of some of these people, but they never mention the waistcoat, unfortunately. So Charles was the son of Catherine Hardy, and she was the daughter of Grace. So Grace is the person whose testimony had been taken. So she appears in the letter of authentication. She was the third wife of Temple Stannion, who indeed had married Susanna Hobbs, who indeed was the daughter of Thomas Hobbs, who was in fact a physician, a doctor in physic. However, look at his date of birth, 1648. So as I said, it aligns with the letter of authentication, but the eagle-eyed among you will have noticed that Thomas Hobbs was born in 1648, on the 11th of May, 1648 to be precise. And he was probably lying in his crib in Winchester when the king was executed 8 months later. Whenever I mention this, which as you can imagine is not very often, it is suggested that it might have been Hobbes' father who attended the king. But I don't think his father was a physician. A little bit more work is required there, but in the Dictionary of National Biographies entry for Thomas Hobbes, he's called a gentleman, Moses Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, however, indeed had royal clients. He later became a surgeon in James II's household. Some say he performed the necropsy, or what we would know as autopsy of Queen Mary in 1694. But for our purposes, it's more important to note that apparently, according to the DNB, and also according to what you see on the screen, he was brought in to bleed Charles II. This is a quote from the DNB. He was brought in to bleed Charles II from the jugular vein in his final illness. Having heard that, you probably ask yourself, did Charles II also have knitted waistcoats? And yes, indeed he did. Maria Hayward has done research and has written about the Stuarts and their clothes, and she definitely mentioned several knitted waistcoats that Charles II had. There is another part of the puzzle. There is another contender for the second shirt put on by the king. According to William Sanderson, the monarch wore a sky-colored satin waistcoat, which can also be found in his wardrobe accounts. So as I said earlier, waistcoat can also mean this type of garment. Jane and I are very much looking forward to seeing this waistcoat, which is kept at Longleat. We will see that next week. So I'll leave you to ponder the situation while I move on with the object history. And I have a content warning. The next slide contains a graphic description or a depiction in many senses of the word of the beheading. So if you don't want to see that, you might want to close your eyes now and I'll tell you when we've moved on. My former colleague, Hilary Davidson, did a research into what actually happens in a beheading where you actually, are in the position you can see on the screen. You're actually kneeling down, and seems to be that the blood spurts forward, because one of the peculiar things with a waistcoat is it doesn't have any stains around the neck. It has only stains on the front of it. Which leads me on to, and now you can open your eyes again, the previous examinations that were done, which were that always concentrated on the stains. So in 1959 already, there were examinations to find out were the stains indeed blood. Some of them gave positive reactions, but they were very weak. There's of course always the possibility that the waistcoat was washed. We don't have any records that it was washed at the museum. I can't say for sure it wasn't. Then in 1988, there was another test, the Castle-Meyer test, and also UV light was used. As you can see here, blood should actually go dark, but it fluoresces. So again, that doesn't necessarily mean what we see isn't blood or human fluid of some sort. In the report that was done at the time, it states, and I quote, "Blood, urine, sweat, semen, vomit, food, drink, and cosmetic preparations are all possible sources of the staining, but since non-destructive tests for those substances would almost certainly give negative or misleading results after 340 years, their true nature remains a matter of conjecture." And then Hillary took on investigated further research, which she did with a forensic science service, which doesn't exist anymore. And the same thing happened. They said the sort of more primitive tests have actually not moved on that much, and the more advanced tests would need taking a sample. And at the time, we didn't want to do that. Now, I'm going to go on to the project and then just tell you a little bit of some of the things we've done before I hand over to James. I'm always come to the end of my part. Why are we doing this project, wanted to do this project now? Some of you might have been to our executions exhibition at the Museum of London Docklands. So this was also done in preparation for the exhibition. So we could sort of find out more before putting it on display. And we also know it will go on display when the new Museum of London opens in 2026. So what were our aims? Our aims are to deepen knowledge about the waistcoat, to exploit recent developments in textile research methodology, to reconstruct the waistcoat in collaboration with a team of specialist knitters and citizen scientists, and to exploit new ways of communicating the results to a wide audience. Some of these are a work in progress. Jane, would you mind just explaining the mapping?
So we started the project by thinking about all the unknown unknowns about the waistcoat, and we put them into what's known as a mapping sentence, which lists all the research variables that we could research in this project, and indeed we would like to research if we get the resources to do so. If I show a blow up here of just one section of the mapping sentence, you can see that among the things we don't know are exactly how it was knitted, and we will talk a bit more about that. Was it flat? Was it round? Or was it a mixture of round and flat knitting? Was it knitted by hand? Was it knitted on a frame or by a machine? Was it knitted in a workshop, a professional workshop? Or was it knitted by a domestic knitter in their home? And did that happen in Southern Europe, Northern Europe, or the United Kingdom? These are all variables that we could explore. And likewise, there are things to do with the materials that were used that we wanted to find out more about. So the mapping sentence allows us to build hypotheses about the different ways in which this waistcoat came into being. And I should say that irrespective of whether it's associated with the royal family, it's an extraordinary survival of a man's undergarment, a knitted undergarment. And we have precious few examples of these from the early modern period. So it's interesting just in terms of its textile history, story it can tell.
Thank you. So, so when we started this project, obviously the first thing we did, we had a very good look at it. Not that we haven't done this before, but we did that again. We also took high-res photographs, high-resolution photographs. For instance, I had never seen the back of it because we really do not disturb it very much. You know, it is a very, very precious object for us. So we hardly ever take it out and it normally is kept on a board. So I'd never seen the back, and you see that here on the screen. This slide also shows how difficult it is to get the color right. It is more the color that you see on the right. It is more this sort of slightly greeny blue, rather than what you see on the left. Other thing we did is we sort of looked for images of its history. So it appeared in John Adcock's wonderful London book, which was published around 1927. You can see it on the left. And then there's sort of other photographs that we have in our picture library from the times when transparencies were taken, etc. And again, a little bit more work there needs to be done. And then we also pulled together information around the around 50 knitted waistcoats that exist. So this is all over the world in museum and private collections. They're usually dated between 1590 and 1700. And a lot of this was based on the work by Mai Ringo, who also came up with this idea of differentiating between brocade knitted waistcoats. So you can see them on the example on the left, and 2/3 of the waistcoats are made like that. So they're made out of two different threads, and the pattern is done by the two different threads. And usually the second thread is metal, gold or silver. And then we have the damask knitted waistcoats. One of them is on the right, but this is also embroidered on top. But the actual pattern is like a sort of damask tablecloth. It's made by the way it is knitted. And these are a bit rarer, and ours is, of course, of the second time. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is that we also looked at waistcoats in other collections, and you can see here one at Drummond Castle. I mean, if I hadn't told you it was Drummond Castle, you might have thought it was another picture of ours. It's very, very similar. It's quite small and it's a bit finer, but it's nevertheless very similar. And again, it's not entirely clear which Earl of Perth has worn it, as we don't entirely know, was it really Charles I, or maybe not. And then the other waistcoat we examined is one that is held by historic royal palaces. It was worn by William III and is quite different from ours. I believe this will go on display later this year, but it is on display already. I will now hand over to Jane.
One of our aims in doing this project was to try and demonstrate the benefit of interdisciplinary work. And I should say that neither Beatrice or I are scientists. So what we were trying to do was find a way that we could work with people who had expertise in scientific analyses, which are more often used on archaeological material than are on historical material, particularly textiles. So one of the first things we did, because it was not quite as invasive as some of the other things we wanted to do, was to collaborate with a colleague from the National Archives who's an expert in microphotometry. And this allowed us to look at to what extent the waistcoat had faded in colour in the past and how much it was likely to fade in the future under different light conditions. So pinpoints of light are shone at particular areas on the waistcoat to try and determine the extent to which it might fade under certain light conditions in the future. And this will help with how the new display for it to go on public view is designed. The results also helped us understand a little bit about the potential for dyes that remain in the fabric. There was a suggestion that there was indigo, which is perhaps not too much of a surprise, if indeed the blue colour it has now was its original colour. So this gave us a little bit of a roadmap for future research. Most of the things we wanted to do required actual samples to be taken from the waistcoat. Now, I've done quite a lot of work at the Centre for Textile Research in Copenhagen with archaeologists who have no qualms about chopping things up, taking quite large samples and then doing things with them in a laboratory, destroying the sample in the process. And what we wanted to do was explore whether we could demonstrate what can be learned from historical material if perhaps we don't take a hacksaw to it, but a scalpel in this case. And one of the big problems with sampling historical material, which, as I say, is not so much conventionally done as in archaeology, is deciding which bits to sample. And clearly it's a good idea not to take parts of the waistcoat which were likely to show when it was on display. And while we were avoiding those, we also wanted to take what were credible samples so that we would get meaningful results. And I can't tell you the amount of time it took for us to get permission in the first place for the sampling, and then to decide which bits to sample took up a great deal of our time and brain power. And as you can see, some of the literature on sampling textiles is contradictory. Some people experienced in doing this suggest that it's really important to take a fragment which is clearly part of the original garment. But other people suggest it's better to take a piece that's already hanging off, because then you aren't doing so much damage to the garment. And so it's very difficult, if you follow that advice, to avoid the deteriorated parts. And who's to say whether those deteriorated parts are A, part of the garment itself, or B, very badly contaminated because they've been dragging around as the garment is examined, or it's been on display, or it's been in storage. We did have some previous guidance. I'd done a project at the Museum of London before as part of my Knitting in Early Modern Europe project, where we tried to develop a sampling strategy for the knitted caps, which exist in large numbers in the Museum of London collection. And so we used this protocol for taking samples from knitted items as guidance. However, when it came to actually taking the scalpel to the waistcoat itself, there were a number of things we had to think about. There were a number of fragments which are in the damaged area at the front, and these were held in place with gauze, which meant that they weren't still actually attached to the body of the garment. So they're problematic for that reason. There were also thread ends inside the garment, and this is where a spool of silk thread has run out, and it's time to introduce a new one. And so this is an important piece of evidence for how the garment was constructed. We didn't want to snip off all the thread ends in such a way that none remained for future researchers, or indeed so that any knots that remained disappeared. And the particularly splendid knot you can see on the screen here is actually one in the Drummond Castle example. And I'm sorry to say that the Museum of London example doesn't have such a splendid knot as this. So it's a point of comparison between the two. We decided that we would take a bit from the fragmented front, and we would take some thread ends in the hope that this would be sufficient for the work we wanted to do. And the target was 6 micrograms. And it took us a while to actually get our heads around what a microgram might look like, which of course is a problem when you're trying to get enough material. And here you can see a very vivid description or illustration of how very little these thread ends were. They registered 0 on the weighing machine we were using. And we didn't know whether that was our user error or whether in fact they were so tiny that there was nothing registering. However, we had taken as much as the permissions allowed us to take, and we hoped that these thread ends would be enough, along with the damaged fragment. There was a great deal of discussion as to whether we should send the thread ends for dye analysis or the fragment from the front for dye analysis, given that it was more likely to be contaminated. And then which of these samples would be more suitable for radiocarbon dating. And in the end, we decided to hedge our bets and use a bit of each for each, which may or may not have been the correct thing to do. So the pieces of research that we're going to discuss in detail today are from this part of the mapping sentence of variables we were examining. First of all, how old is the waistcoat? Is it 16th century when these knitted waistcoats first appear in the literature? Is it 17th century, therefore likely to sit well with the anecdotal evidence for it? Or is it perhaps 18th century or 19th century? Is it a fake? The radiocarbon dating, we hoped, would give us some answers to that. The other thing we're interested in is whether or not the waistcoat is green, is it blue, or is it actually a different colour? And it's long since faded to this washed out blue that we see today. Some of the other issues are to do with the material. Is it made of wool or silk or something else? We had a little bit of a wobble around whether or not it was silk, which is a story for another day. We're pretty sure it is silk. And Beatrice has already mentioned the issue of terminology, that it is in fact a waistcoat by contemporary terms. So our first learning trip was to Zurich, where we worked with Professor Urke Hajdas, who is a pioneer in the radiocarbon dating of textiles. And what we wanted to do was not just pay an expert to do the dating for us, we wanted to understand the process of radiocarbon dating, so we would be in a position to interpret the results appropriately. This is something I've experienced before, is if you don't understand the process, you sometimes get sent a set of results, which you then need the lab to explain to you, and then you're still none the wiser, because you're not actually sure what has a bearing on the context of those results. So off we went to Zurich, and we first of all learned how to examine the samples under the microscope to check for obvious signs of contamination. We also learned to use an FTIR machine so that we could profile the constituent parts of the sample and make sure that it was actually what we thought it was, and it wasn't full of other chemicals that might interfere with our results. So this is me in the lab doing the pre-treatment for textiles, which are going to be radiocarbon dated. And that consists of an acid-alkali acid treatment. And normally a textile would be put through Professor Hajdas's discovery, which is what's called the SocAntiquaries system. And that involves harsh boiling in acid after this acid-base acid pre-treatment. Now, it was a bit of a surprise to us, having read all the literature, that Professor Hajdas said while we were there, I think that's going to be too harsh treatment for your delicate silk, so we're not going to do that. So it didn't go through the SocAntiquaries treatment we were expecting it to go through. If you look at the close-up of the test tubes, you can see how very fragile and delicate the fabric looks after its pre-treatment in acid, alkali, and acid. So we were somewhat concerned about what was going to happen to it next when it looked so fragile, even more fragile than it had when we harvested it from the garment. So here are our results from two separate radiocarbon dating tests. The average of those two is shown in the big graph below. Now, we were most concerned that it was going to turn out to be 18th or 19th century, and we'd have to say that likely it was a fake or the anecdotal evidence had been fabricated. But no, we had to bend our brains around the fact that the date came back as 1419. And there is absolutely no evidence, no credible evidence for anything knitted in silk in the medieval period. So it's a very, very unlikely date, especially when you put it in the context of other well-dated knitted waistcoats made in silk. So we went back to the literature and we read many, many papers about the problems with radiocarbon dating. And it has moved on so fast over the past 30 or 40 years. There are many things to learn. And one of the things that's really important is understanding sources of contamination, especially with a garment that has no written records of previous conservation work. And one of the sources of contamination can be petrochemical-based conservation treatments. That's because anything petrochemical essentially comes from fossilized sources. So it's throwing the date way back, far, far earlier than knitted silk waistcoats. Now, we don't know whether petrochemicals were used in its conservation in the past, we need to do more work with, for example, the FTIR machine, and also look at more precise ways of doing radiocarbon dating. Compound radiocarbon analysis actually isolates a protein in the silk, and we'd be testing that for its date, rather than, if you like, the mass of the silk with all the other things that might be running around in it. So that's a way forward for us in trying to pin down the date more accurately. Our other research trip, and this sounds like we are swanning around Europe, but these were very, very quick research trips during which we had very intensive learning experiences. And in Lisbon, we worked with Dr. Paula Nabeish, who's a heritage conservation expert at the Nova School of Science and Technology. She is a dye analysis specialist, and I'd worked with her before to consider how we might test the dye stuffs in the knitted caps I'd been studying, several of which are at the Museum of London. So Beatrice and I also worked on some of those samples while we were in Lisbon, if you like, as a practice run for when we looked at the waistcoat samples. And Paula and I were able to publish this article suggesting some of the dye stuffs for the knitted caps in the 16th century. This is a summary of the specialist research that Paula undertakes in Lisbon. And these are the 4 types of dye analysis to which our waistcoat samples were subjected. The first thing we learned to do, although I have to say a lot of the machinery that's used for this is very, very sensitive, and mostly Beatrice and I watched while Paula did it, but it was really illuminating to see what you can learn from this kind of approach to early modern materials. This particular process isolates elements in the material, and this can sometimes suggest dye stuffs or indeed conservation treatments. Calcium and iron were the 2 that popped up for us, and we don't really know what that means, but it wasn't going to prove a problem in terms of the other techniques. So the next technique that we learned about was fluorescent spectroscopy. And this is a process which harvests the light emitted by a material to capture its fluorescence capacity. And that suggests ways forward for other kinds of dye analysis. Now, what we found with this was that there was a great deal of fluorescence from the silk itself, rather than from the dye stuffs. And potentially, there's a yellow dye in there, or it's the actual natural color of the silk shining through and getting in the way of the dye stuffs. So again, we learned how dye analysis is not a straightforward process, and this was really interesting to us to discover that something might be there but hiding from sight, even with this sort of precision analysis. Paula then introduced us to micro-Raman spectroscopy, which is particularly good at identifying indigo. And that was confirmed as being in the waistcoat, which was not a surprise from the microphotometry research that we'd had done before. But the real, if you like, top of the pyramid for dye analysis is high-performance liquid chromatography. And that is a destructive process, so it has to come last in the system for dye analysis, because once that's done, the material is gone. We were very excited to discover what would happen with this, but it took a very long time to get to this stage in the process. So I'm going to make you wait like we had to wait to hear the actual results. So the dye analysis itself is interesting for a number of reasons, not least to know whether it was dyed and what it was dyed with, but also because silk in the 17th century could be fabulously vivid in colour. And this waistcoat of William III and his green stockings illustrate that really well. But our blue, and indeed Drummond Castle's blue, rather washed out waistcoat, really doesn't speak of that splendor that could be achieved in the 17th century. And we wanted to try and find a way to give these 3 waistcoats, the one in Scotland, the one in London, and the one in Oslo, rejuvenation, if you like, in colour, if possible. But we also added to the mix a poor cousin of these 3 noble waistcoats. This is a fragmentary waistcoat that I knew about from Lindisfarne Priory. It's in bits, and Ruth Gilbert has done work where she suggested how these fragments could be arranged to suggest a waistcoat, maybe from 1540 to 1603, if the context suggests the date accurately. And under the microscope, this Lindisfarne Priory waistcoat could be red. You can see there's one fibre in the far right bottom picture where there's a suggestion of a pinky glow. And one of the things that Beatrice and I learnt in Lisbon was that under the microscope, it's possible to pinpoint the part of a sample that's worth exploring further. And you can see on the left in the bottom photograph, the London waistcoat has this very bright blue fibre. Now, we don't know if that's contamination or whether that's a silk fibre that still retains the dye stuff really well inside it. But under the microscope, this helps to direct further research. So I was rather hoping that the Lindisfarne Priory waistcoat would turn out to be red, because the documentary evidence suggests that a lot of knitted waistcoats were red. And there's a health issue associated with that, which again is a story for another day. So Paula was able to tell us that there was definitely indigotin in the Museum of London waistcoat. There might be some yellow, but we're not sure because of the problem with the fluorescence of the silk itself. There's definitely the same in the Drummond Castle waistcoat, but it also has a yellow dye for certain, which is a plant called the flax-leaved daphne. And the Lindisfarne waistcoat is actually dyed with buckthorn, which means it was probably a bright yellow when it was first knitted. So there's an intriguing yellow in these results. And what I wonder, and Beatrice and I have discussed, especially in the light of William III's green stockings, is, are we looking here at the washed out remains of a bright green waistcoat? It's just that the yellow dye is completely gone, or only there in a very teasing way. We wanted to know the colour if we're going to go ahead and try and do a reconstruction experiment. For this, we worked with 5 fibre and knitting specialists, volunteers and professionals, and we set up an online group so that we could share ideas, not least because one of our volunteers was in America. We recruited someone from Belgium who is a machine knitting specialist, and we thought it would be interesting to see whether we could find a way of reconstructing the waistcoat using machine knitting so that everyone could have one, or if we wanted to have more examples for education work or display, it would be cheaper and easier to reconstruct them by hand. The first thing we needed to do was investigate what sort of thread to use. We hadn't completed the technical analysis of the waistcoat itself at the point we needed to start knitting. And also we knew we were going to be constrained by what was available commercially to buy, because we weren't at the point where we could commission specially made silk thread. And so these are examples of the samples made by members of the team. The white one at the bottom is one of the machine knitted samples, which was made by Stephanie in Belgium. Now, for those of you, and I'm sure there are some of you out there who are knitting nerds, I thought you'd be interested in the gauge of the waistcoat. That is the number of stitches in the columns, the wales, and the number of stitches in the rows or the courses. Now, these numbers come from the sleeves of the waistcoat. There's a great variation in the gauge throughout the waistcoat itself. And the gauge for the sleeves came out at an average of 18 wales and 25 courses per inch, or 75 wales, 91 courses per 10 centimetres for anyone who thinks in metric. We were able to buy a commercial silk from De Beers. It's an embroidery silk. The only colour we could get it in was this gold called beeswax, and it's comprised of 2 times 18 bundles of filaments, so 36 strands, very loosely twisted just to hold it together. And the knitter used 8 1.2 millimetre knitting needles made of metal to do the work. So we actually had 2 sleeves knitted, and I've brought them with us so you can have a touchy-feely moment later. You can even put one of them on because it is knitted round. The other one is knitted flat, and that was because we wanted to test the hypothesis about how it was knitted. But the one entire sleeve knitted by the professional knitter, Chrissy Carney, took her 100 hours. And that gives us an indication of how long it might take her to knit an entire waistcoat if we're able to go forward and do that. Probably 600 hours. And part of that is doing things, as you can see in the middle photograph there, figuring out the grids from which she knitted the motifs in the pattern. And she was ingenious in putting that together. So after the sleeve was knitted, the one knitted round was knitted, we had a day at the Museum of London in the Docklands to compare the original with the test swatches and also the knitted sleeve. And after that, we invited 4 knitting specialists, here's Susan North from the V&A, to come and examine both the reconstruction and the original and give us feedback on how well they thought it was replicated. Now, from that whole collaborative process, we think, and we're not the first people to say this, but there is very little published on this waistcoat, despite the fact that it's an iconic garment. We believe that the waistcoat was knitted round from the bottom up, and then it was split at the top so that the sleeves could be attached. And they were also knitted round, starting at the cuff and going up to the shoulder. There were some very specific technical things we discovered from the reconstruction. Although the reconstruction is the same size as the original, and it mimics the pattern of motifs in the original, we had to repeat this pattern fewer times along the length of the sleeve because the thread we were using had a thicker diameter. So we can't say it's a replica. It's a reconstruction, a work in progress. It was an experimental reconstruction to help us ascertain things like this. And it doesn't matter how many times you count the motifs on the original. When you actually then come to knit them, you sort of count them in a different way. And this was very instructive. So for example, there are 2/3 of the original number of repeats in the reconstruction, which really helped us think about how they were spaced in the original. And that led us to realize that there are differences in the way we'd interpreted the motifs to the way they actually occur in the original. There are also blank areas near what's called the jog, and that's the little change in the knitting as you come to the end of a course and you start the next course to go around. And some people refer to that as a false seam. The blank areas near the jog had completely passed us by when we looked at the original. We didn't realize they were there. We hadn't noticed them. It was only when we compared the reconstruction with the original that we realized those blank areas existed. We also realized that the position of the increases in the sleeve in relation to this jog was different from what we'd expected it to be. And that's because some of the knitting was obscured by the raised surface, and it made us count the stitches or loops more carefully. The other thing that was very interesting, which we hadn't anticipated, is if you look at the bottom picture on the right, you can see that the loops are slanting. Now, the original doesn't have that effect, and potentially that's to do with the way the knitter pulled the yarn or the thread as she was knitting, Or it may be that over time, the original has relaxed so that the loops have regained a more symmetrical position. And we need to do more experimentation, maybe using a different knitter. I haven't volunteered to do that myself, but I feel it might be coming. Someone who knits in a different way and pulls the thread in a different way, or potentially Chrissy can change the way she knits to change that. This is the only substantial previously published work on the waistcoat, which came out in 1943 by Mary Thomas. She published these grids, which she said were an accurate representation of the pattern motifs in the waistcoat. But in fact, we knew before we started that they weren't quite right, but we hadn't got our eye in sufficiently to be sure how they diverged from the original. And so actually knitting a reconstruction helped us correct these grids. And another thing that's very interesting is that she said in her work that it was a prodigious piece and that it was perfect. There were no errors. But we can say there are a lot of errors in it. And Chrissy was very happy about this because she several times tried to knit back where she knew she'd made an error, and it took hours of her time, so that eventually she just kept going because there was no way she'd get to the end if she didn't accept there would be errors. So, in conclusion, what Beatrice and I feel has been very useful for us as researchers is to reflect on what we regard as our comfort zone. We're very happy with the art historical method, examining, recording, comparing a textile or a garment with another or other examples. We're very happy researching the social context of a garment. And we're also happy to look at provenance and delve into sources that help us with that information. But this made us step outside our comfort zone, and we did struggle with the sampling. We tried very hard to understand the relevant terminology and the techniques, the parameters of those techniques. And we're not experts, but we do feel we're in a much stronger position to direct this kind of research and work with people who are specialists, not in textiles, but in scientific analyses. And together we could do a better job than just getting them to do a contracted piece of work and for us to receive a report that means very little to us. We do feel more confident about how we would interpret results. And here we are, look, presenting them without Paula here to explain the dye analysis for us, which is what we've done before. But we also wanted to mention that it wasn't just working with the scientific analysis teams that put us outside our comfort zone. We're both very competent textile specialists. We can both knit, we can sew, we understand the production process of historical textiles, and we regard ourselves as having a practical approach to that. But when we came to work with craft specialists who do this kind of textile production day in, day out, they understand the fibre from working with it all the time. We realised that that was a little bit outside our comfort zone too. And that's because they use weird and wonderful terminology, and they made assumptions about what we knew, and we made assumptions about what they knew. And so we needed to go through the same process of having a collaborative dialogue to be able to work constructively with those people too. So I think if we've learned anything, it's that interdisciplinary work is really worthwhile, but it's also pretty scary, and you need to have the courage to jump in with both feet rather than just dip your toe in the water. That's why we look a little bit like we might be drowning. These are our collaborators, and there were a lot of them, and we want to thank all of them for their contributions to the project. We have made quite a few research outputs from this project already, but we would like to do more, not least write up what we're telling you this evening. And we do have a working bibliography. This isn't all the material that we've used to put this presentation together. But if anybody would like to have copies of our outputs and our bibliography, we're more than happy to share them. And here are our email addresses. Thank you very much indeed for this opportunity to present our research, not least to say thank you very much to the Society of Antiquaries for having helped fund the work. We're very grateful. Yes.
Thank you very much indeed. That was a really splendid talk. I must say, as an archaeologist who is used to doing interdisciplinary work, it's really great to see such a well-constructed piece of interdisciplinary work, thinking about the problems and perspectives different people involved. Very, very excited to see that. And it's just reflecting for a moment that the Society is very generous, received very generous benefaction from Janet Arnold, which is the fund that has supported this work. And I think it's a tremendous value of that research fund that we see shown in your work today. So thank you very much indeed. I must say, I'm just one half question from me before I open it to the floor. I'm interested in the problems of the radiocarbon dating. And it did pass through my mind that this might be to do with the age of the silk rather than the garment. And I wondered whether there's any possibility that the garment is being made with a very old collection of silk.
As they say, I'm very glad you asked me that. Yes, I've actually written an article which appears in the Finnish Society of Antiquaries journal about that very thing. And I've discussed in that, and we've discussed as well, how little we know about the life cycle of materials harvested for textiles before they're actually made up, either into woven or knitted fabric or a garment. And there are famous examples of radiocarbon dating of garments, which have turned out to be much earlier. And then there's credible evidence for why the fabric may have been purchased 50 or 60 years earlier than the garment was made. And we all know how a lovely thing can be husbanded away until the appropriate occasion comes. And I think that's definitely a possibility, that the silk is much older than the garment. But the limited work that we've done on that suggests that silk actually, in the cocoon, or as real silk, once the filaments are out of the cocoon, is not actually very stable. It doesn't last very long. But of course, who's to say? It may very well be much older silk. It would be really interesting to do more work to find out if that is the answer.
Thank you. Can I open the room for questions? If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and Rebecca will come across with the mic.
This is a very simple question, but it's difficult, obviously, seeing it on a screen to assess how large or how small this garment is. Charles I was a tiny man, and Charles II was a very, very large, tall man. Can you talk a little bit about the size of this garment?
Yeah, that's a very good point. It is a bit more on the small side, but it's not as small as the one in Drummond Castle. I haven't got the measurements on me. So that's partly also why we're going to Longleat, also to have a look at that. And I know Historical Palaces has one or two buff coats, again, slightly different sizes that are meant to belong to Charles I. So that there's a bit more work we have to do there. It is, yeah, it's neither very small nor very large. So I'm sorry, I'm hedging my bets here. But I also, it is quite stretchy. So But in that respect, it would also be very, very good to have a reproduction, because that would, you know, you could get someone to put it on, you know, and then, yeah, see what happens. So no, there's a bit more work there to be done, but it's not obvious, I would say. That's what I'm trying to say, really.
Thank you. That was fascinating. This is the Makawa corner over here. Ernest was, I think, my great uncle. And it's very good to hear that even if it wasn't necessarily Charles I's final garment that our ancestor bought and passed on, it was clearly a very interesting object in its own right. The question, I'd be interested to know, what is it about anecdotes and about connections with famous people? I mean, I rather imagine that it's not the only object in a museum or collection which arrived with a story which has since turned out to be a little wobbly. Is that a thing, or was Ernest significantly more gullible than other people turning up at Christie's 100 years ago?
Again, another very good question. So when we get to write this up, there's actually quite a lot more to be said. So in the late 19th, early 20th century, there were several exhibitions about Cromwellian and Stuart, so-called relics. Relics was the word at the time. And what always amuses me the most, and my predecessor, Kay Staniland, has written about this, is that Charles I must have given away like 30 gloves while he was waiting to be beheaded. So a lot of collections, including Lambeth Palace, and I think they're going to put something on display because there's an anniversary coming up next year, I think. We have a few gloves that belonged to the king, supposedly. So yes, unfortunately, I probably will never have time to do something substantial about it, but I always think it would make a wonderful PhD. But someone definitely should bring together in an exhibition or as a book or PhD all the different objects that supposedly belonged to Charles I. Particularly, as I said, the gloves, that always amuses me. Yes, it's very much like that.
Are there any other questions or comments in the room? There's one down here and we've got one online, I think. There's one down here, Rebecca, if we take before we go online.
My question was following on from the last one. In what context did it appear at Christie's? Was it a generalized sale of odds and ends, or was it a particular collection? Do you know anything about the original sale?
Yeah, as I said, it was sort of sold 3 times. So the first 2 times by J.C. Stevens, and then the 3rd time by Christie's. I have that information, but I haven't got it in my head. I think it was sort of with other, again, so-called relics. But I'm afraid I can't answer that at the moment. But there was quite a lot in the papers about it, you know, in the sketch with imagery. There were quite a lot of articles. So each time, particularly last time it went on sale, there was a lot in the papers. And I think the last time when it was bought by Ernest Makawa, it went for £200, which is quite a lot in 1924.
Does the pattern give any indication of the date, e.g. were particular patterns fashionable at particular points?
I think that the simple answer to that is no, because the pattern is unlike most of the other patterned knitted silk waistcoats in existence. Some of you may know that most of them are in Scandinavian collections. And so many of the patterns in these waistcoats are based on a star, which is not difficult to create in knitting. What's unusual in this waistcoat is these funny, what have been termed tree of life motifs. And then the sort of double diamond, which is quite common and not difficult to achieve. And then there's the band across the center that divides the yoke from the body part of the garment, and that is present in other examples, but it's less common. So I would say, sadly, the pattern is another one of the mysteries in this waistcoat. And actually, one of the corrections we managed to do in the reconstruction was work out the position of that tree of life in relation to the other motifs, which solves one of the mathematical problems we were having with the number of courses that it requires to knit the sleeve. And anyone who's here who's a knitter will know that getting things mathematically satisfactory is one of the joys of knitting. So when you find something that doesn't quite work, it's troubling. And correcting that was one of the really satisfying outcomes for us.
I think there's one final question. And can you wait for the mic because they can't hear you online otherwise?
Thank you so much for this presentation. I work with fabrics myself in my business, but I don't, does silk tend to shrink? Could it have been larger and then shrunk over time with cleaning or other things?
One of the critical issues about which is relevant to that question is whether the silk was knitted with the gum still in it, the sericin, or whether the silk had been prepared in such a way that the gum was gone, and then it was knitted with, if you like, clean silk. There's been a reconstruction project in the Netherlands run by Crystal Brandenburg at the Textile Research Centre in Leiden. And she was attempting to recreate a pair of 17th century stockings that were shipwrecked off Texel. And they experimented with gummed and degummed silk and found it was much easier to knit with gummed silk than degummed silk. And certainly when the gum was washed out, that allowed the silk to loosen up and expand rather than shrink. I'm not aware of silk having a propensity to shrink. But as Beatrice mentioned, knitting has a propensity to stretch. So I think working out the potential interplay between those two things would be another very fruitful avenue of research.
Thank you.
And maybe one thing I'd like to mention to do with that, we have a letter from the 1840s where someone says, I tried to get the waistcoat for you to have a look at, but it's been looked at so much and used so much that I can't get it for you at the moment. Sort of, I'm phrasing very badly. So, you know, for all we know, it might well have been worn at times, you know, in the past. That particular letter seems to suggest that people might have put it on and handed it around at gatherings where at some point that made me wonder about the stains as well.
We've had an absolutely splendid lecture, and you can gather from the interest in the questions how much people have enjoyed it. So can we express our thanks to our speakers once again? I give notice that the next meeting will be an out of London meeting held in Exeter on Thursday, the 8th of February 2024 at 12:30 p.m. Note the time if you want to follow us online, when we will hear a paper, People and Place in the Kingdom of Northumbria, New Project and Fieldwork Perspectives by Professor Sarah Semple. The meeting stands adjourned.